Perhaps the most catastrophic loss in the history of ancient Rome, the Battle of Carrhae took place in 53 BC. Under the leadership of the affluent and aspirational Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, the Roman army attempted to extend its power into Mesopotamian lands, at that time ruled by the formidable Parthians. The problem was, Crassus misjudged the Parthians' superior cavalry and tactics, especially their skillful use of horse archers and cataphracts, confronted by the powerful army under Surena. It was a bloody battle, and it saw the Romans soundly defeated, with great casualties, and even the capture of Crassus himself, who was later killed. In addition to stopping Roman eastward expansion, this devastating defeat also caused political instability back in Rome, ultimately fueling the power struggles that resulted in the fall of the Roman Republic. This conflict between Roman military power and Parthian cavalry prowess at the Battle of Carrhae is a moving illustration of the strategic difficulties of ancient warfare, and of course, the long-lasting effects of these military setbacks on historical development. And that's what we're going to discuss today. Here we are once again, back in ancient Roman times, but not quite in ancient Rome. If you like this sort of stuff, do the like, comment, subscribe thing. You know what to do. But let's now begin as we go back to the nightmare of all Romans. First, set the scene a little bit. All of the politics that paved the way for Rome's war with Parthia were orchestrated by the so-called First Triumvirate. Now, this First Triumvirate was composed, of course, of Pompeius Magnus, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, all of whom stood to benefit from their cooperative arrangements. In March and April of 56 BC, they gathered at Ravenna and Lucca, both located in Caesar's province of Cisalpine Gaul, to renew the pact they had originally formed 4 years earlier. So together, they agreed to consolidate all of their supporters and all of their resources to pass legislation that would expand Caesar's authority in Gallic territories and to influence the upcoming elections of 55 BC in their favor, all with the aim of securing a second joint consulship for Crassus and Pompey. Traditional means proved to be quite effective, awarding military commands, placing political allies in key offices, these sorts of things, and of course the pushing forward of laws that protected all of their own interests in a rather clever and secretive way. Additionally, financial influence, personal ties fostered through friendship and patronage, and of course the muscle of 1,000 troops brought from Gaul by Publius Crassus's son were used to sway the elections. It's hard to say no to that many angry men with weapons, of course. So the triumvirate thus succeeded in ensuring the consulship and most of the other high-profile positions. It was a stunning success. By way of legislation known as the Lex Trebonia, introduced by the tribune Trebonius, both consuls secured extended proconsulships of 5 years, mirroring the arrangements Caesar already enjoyed in Gaul. As for Pompey, he didn't do so bad himself. He was awarded these Spanish provinces, pretty far away from Rome, but certainly not a bad place to be. Crassus, he prepared to acquire Syria, equally far away from Rome, but with a few more enemies at the doorstep. This was, of course, an unmistakable signal that he intended to wage war on Parthia, whether for riches, whether for glory, or perhaps a mixture of both. He was going to do it. Meanwhile, let's talk about Parthia itself. Now, when we talk about Parthia, we are talking about the Persians, the inheritors of the Achaemenid Empire, this kind of thing. Think about it in that general area, south of Turkey, east of Syria, an empire of its own. And it was itself in the grip of a succession crisis that erupted in 57 BC, sparked, of course, by the assassination of King Phraates III at the hands of his own sons, that being Mithridates IV and Orodes II. Both, of course, vied for control of the realm, though Orodes initially appointed his brother as king of Media as a temporary compromise after emerging victorious in the first phase of the conflict. But this was a truce that was short-lived. Orodes reignited hostilities, prompting Mithridates to seek refuge with Aulus Gabinius. That was, of course, the Roman proconsul of Syria. As for Gabinius, he briefly contemplated intervening in the succession dispute on Mithridates' behalf so that Rome could install him as a puppet king and, claim Parthia for himself. However, he ultimately chose to become embroiled in the internal politics of Ptolemaic Egypt instead, leaving Mithridates to pursue his own agenda. Of course, without those Roman resources he could have really needed to tip the scales. Oh, Ptolemaic Egypt, by the way, Ptolemaic dynasty being the Macedonian Greek dynasty that took over after Alexander the Great. At this time, they were ruled by the Macedonian Greeks, the last of which, of course, was Cleopatra Philopator, the seventh, I believe. Correct me in the comments if I have made a mistake with that. I'm pretty well sure this is the seventh. Well, back to the Battle of Carrhae. As for Mithridates pressing forward alone, he decided that he would waste no time in mounting an invasion of Babylonia. And he did okay for a little while. But unfortunately, in comes the main character of our story to oppose him, Surena and his mighty army, Parthia's most formidable military commander. Hard to go up against him, that's for sure. Well, upon succeeding Gabinius, Crassus also sought to forge an alliance with Mithridates, and in 54 BC he launched his own campaign into Osroene, a client kingdom of Parthia, though he largely remained on the left bank of the Balik River awaiting additional forces. Meanwhile, in Seleucia, on the Tigris River, Surena besieged, defeated, and killed Mithridates. This, of course, left him with no surviving rivals in Parthia. Orodes next marched north to attack Armenia, who was at the time a Roman ally. As soon as he arrived, King Artavasdes II cast his lot with the invading Parthian army, cementing Orodes' position and leaving Rome's plans in the east vulnerable to an impending confrontation. Of course, then we have the other main character of the story, the wildly and stupidly rich Marcus Crassus. In fact, one of the wealthiest figures in Rome at the time. He was about 62 years old when he joined the campaign against Parthia. Ancient commentators, including his biographer Plutarch, often highlight greed as his primary flaw, and the main incentive behind his decision to go to war. Of course, we got a little bit from Plutarch later on that I'll read, but we'll get to that later. Don't worry, I won't forget. The bulk of modern historians tend to see his motivations as more of a unquenchable thirst for wealth. Pure, old-fashioned greed. Nothing starts wars like greed. A desire to match Pompey's military eminence, and of course a rivalry rooted in the fact that his long-ago military successes never quite measured up to Pompey's, and following 5 years of warfare in Gaul also paled in comparison to Caesar's. So among this triumvirate, he seemed to be the least impressive. Sure, he was most rich, but when it comes to money, there's diminishing returns after a while, and the real glory in Rome was not money, but it was victory. This was, of course, not to say that he didn't have a few victories under his belt. I mean, the most notable one was the defeat of Spartacus in 71 BC. That's right, Spartacus of the Third Servile War. This was about 10 years earlier. The triumph he had delivered for Sulla at the Battle of Colline Gate, too. Of course, from Gaul, Caesar expressed support for the Parthian campaign in a letter to Crassus, implying that he viewed Crassus's expedition not as a competition, but as a complement to his own pursuits. But of course, Crassus's decision to invade Parthia was largely driven by the assumption that the campaign would simply be an easy one, an old-fashioned Roman beat-down, the barbarians getting what they damn well deserve. It was a belief informed by how Roman legions had already bested other eastern powers, such as Pontus and Armenia, despite the latter fielding larger armies. And of course, past performance is indeed, it has to be, indicative of future returns. Cicero, however, pointed to an additional factor, come to ruin everybody's fun, of course, the ambitions of Publius Crassus, Marcus's gifted son, who had amassed a sterling record leading campaigns in Gaul under Caesar. Once Publius returned to Rome as a decorated hero, he didn't waste much time in laying the groundwork for his personal political aspirations, and there were plenty of those. In the Roman estimation, the Battle of Carrhae would come to represent not merely a catastrophe for the Republic and a humiliation for Marcus Crassus, but also the tragic demise of the once promising future of Publius. Well, many Romans vehemently opposed an offensive against Parthia, of course, especially given that Rome and Parthia were at this time bound by treaty, and it doesn't look good to anyone's estimation when treaties are broken for no good reason, or really for any reason. Cicero himself labeled this conflict in the Latin naming convention nulla causa, meaning, of course, without any justification. But even so, Crassus pressed on with his preparations. No one could talk him out of this one. He was going to get his glory, he was going to get his riches, and prove that he was just as important as all the other boys. The tribune Aetius Capito fought strenuously to prevent the enterprise and ultimately resorted to a notorious act. He conducted a public execration ritual meant to curse Crassus as he departed. Well, it seems like it probably could have been estimated to have worked. But I better not give away the spoilers. On November 14th, 55 BC, Marcus Crassus set out from Rome, despite dire omens and ongoing protests. In the winter of 54 to 53, he was joined in Syria by Publius Crassus, who brought with him 1,000 Celtic cavalrymen from Gaul. Their unwavering loyalty to the younger Crassus would endure right up to their final moments on the battlefield. Upon his late-year arrival in Syria in 55 BC, Marcus Crassus wasted no time putting his legendary fortune to use by mustering a substantial army with the power of the coin. According to Plutarch, he gathered 7 legions, roughly 28 to 35,000 heavy infantry. Moreover, he had around 4,000 light infantry and 4,000 cavalry at his disposal. which included the 1,000 Gallic horsemen personally brought by his son Publius. The backing of Hellenic communities in Syria, along with approximately 6,000 cavalry contributed by Artavasdes, the king of Armenia, remember, a Roman ally at the time, further strengthened Crassus's forces. Artavasdes, in addition to offering 30,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, also advised Crassus to march through Armenia. This, of course, would mean that he didn't have to traverse the desert, which, of course, nobody wants to do that. Rather than accept this counsel, Crassus instead chose a more direct route through Mesopotamia, aiming to seize the region's major cities. Once again, the themes of hubristic greed run throughout this talk. Orodes II, the Parthian king, responded by splitting his own forces. He personally led the larger contingent, consisting mainly of foot archers supported by a number of limited cavalry, on a mission to punish the Armenians. The remaining component of his army, commanded by Spahod Surena, and composed entirely of cavalry, was sent out to track and harass the troops of Crassus. You see, Orodes, he believed Surena's smaller unit would struggle to defeat Crassus outright and merely hoped to buy a bit of time, delay him somewhat. Plutarch remarks that Surena's force contained 1,000 mail-clad horsemen and an even greater number of light-armed cavalry supported by a following of about 1,000 attendants, slaves, and vassals. These Parthian forces also relied on a baggage train that included 1,000 camels. Around this time, Crassus received direction from the Oroen chieftain Ariamnes, a man known to have aided Pompey during the operations in the eastern provinces. Although Ariamnes was actually on the Parthian payroll, Crassus chose that it was wise to trust him. Ariamnes falsely insisted that the Parthians were disorganized and weak, urging Crassus, of course, to strike without hesitation. Leading the Roman forces deep into the desert, Ariamnes guided them far away from any natural sources of water. Subsequently, a letter arrived from Artavasdes warning Crassus that the main Parthian host was in Armenia and pleading for support. Crassus, however, ignored this plea and continued his march through Mesopotamia, where he soon encountered Surena's cavalry about a mile outside of the town of Carrhae. We finally arrive. So, as word spread among Crassus's men that a Parthian force, numbering around 10,000, stood in their path, panic began to set in. Cassius, serving as one of Crassus's top commanders, advised them to align in the classic Roman formation. Cavalry on the wings, infantry at the center, protect the flanks, and push forward. Nothing beats that, right? Now initially Crassus approved this plan, but he soon changed course, reconfiguring the legions into a more hollow square of 12 cohorts on each side. Well, that arrangement might prevent the Parthians from outflanking them. It also impaired the Romans' mobility. Pressing forward, they soon reached a small stream. Several of Crassus's officers recommended establishing camp and resuming the fight the next morning, giving the troops time to restock their provisions. But Publius was eager for more immediate action, and managed to convince his father that the best move was to confront the Parthians right there and then. No wasting time. Let's get it done. To unnerve the Roman legions, the Parthians resorted to deliberately unsettling tactics. First, they produced a thunderous din by pounding on numerous hollow drums which disturbed the Roman soldiers through its sheer volume and piercing resonance. Next, Surena instructed his cataphracts to ride forward with cloaks draped over their armor. The moment they came into the Romans' line of sight, they simultaneously stripped off these coverings, dazzling the onlookers with their gleaming armor, an intimidating display intended to weaken the Roman morale. Initially, Surena had planned to break the Roman ranks outright by ordering a powerful charge of his cataphracts. But realizing that this alone would not suffice, at least at that stage, he instead dispatched his horse archers to encircle the Roman square. When Crassus sent forward his skirmishers in an attempt to repel these mounted archers, they were quickly driven back by a barrage of arrows. Soon afterwards, the legionaries themselves came under relentless arrow fire. Although the Roman infantry carried heavy armor and a large scuta, that being shields, these defensive measures did not fully cover their bodies. And of course, when you have that many arrows, well, a few of them are bound to get through. Ancient sources describe cases in which the arrow shafts pinned soldiers' shields to their limbs and even nailed their feet to the ground. Plutarch, in particular, recounts that a hail of arrows sailed through soft or hard barriers alike, although some modern historians suggest that most injuries were likely non-fatal hits to exposed extremities. It's still not ideal. Well, repeatedly the Romans tried to close with the horse archers, hoping to engage them at close quarters and sort them out the old-fashioned way. But the Parthians easily just kept riding out of reach, releasing so-called Parthian shots on their way out. In response, the legionaries adopted the testudo formation by locking their shields together, kind of like a turtle formation, we also call it. It creates this almost impenetrable shell against missile fire. Very easy to walk up to the front gate of a citadel like that without taking much damage. Well, unless they pour the boiling water all over you, that doesn't help very much. Yet even within that tight formation, their ability to fight back at close range was significantly diminished. Spotting this vulnerability, the Parthian cataphracts carried out repeated charges, striking terror in the Roman lines and causing severe casualties. Whenever the Romans attempted to spread out and ward off the cataphracts, the mounted archers would ride in once again, peppering the now looser ranks with more arrows. Well, desperate for relief, Crassus hoped that his men might simply endure this living hell until the Parthians exhausted their arrow supply. I mean, it's a solid strategy. They've got to run out of arrows eventually, surely. However, a massive camel train accompanied Surena's force, do you remember? And that continuously replenished the horse archers' quivers. There's plenty more where that came from. Realizing after a while that the arrows were just going to keep on coming, Crassus dispatched his son Publius, leading 1,300 Gallic cavalry, 500 archers, and 8 cohorts of legionaries to drive off the archers. The Parthians then feigned retreat, luring Publius's contingent away from the rest of the army. After his men had suffered considerable losses from relentless arrow fire, Publius found himself suddenly confronted by the Parthian cataphracts. He tried to escape, but the horse archers blocked his retreat. Although the Gallic cavalry fought valiantly, their equipment and weaponry were simply not good enough. They couldn't stand up to the superior equipment of the Parthians, and they were eventually forced to withdraw to a small hill. As for Publius, he wasn't keen on being captured and paraded. He decided to take his own life, while the remainder of his force was either slaughtered or left severely depleted, with only 500 survivors spared. By the time Crassus realized his son was in peril, he ordered a general advance, still ignorant of Publius's fate. Not long after, he was met with the gruesome sight of Publius's head impaled on a Parthian spear, If that doesn't affect morale, I don't know what will. To compound the misery of the Romans, Surena's horse archers now swarmed around the infantry of Crassus, unleashing arrows from every angle, while the cataphracts charged repeatedly, further disorienting the Romans. Darkness brought the only reprieve. Traumatized by his son's death, the grieving Crassus directed his soldiers to withdraw to the nearby town of Carrhae. Tragically, the 4,000 wounded men that he left behind were all slowly and methodically slain by the Parthians the following morning, on the very spots where they lay in agony. During the night, 4 Roman cohorts lost their way and found themselves on a hill surrounded by Parthians. Only 20 Romans managed to survive that dreadful predicament. Surena, seeking to capitalize on his advantage, made attempts at negotiation the very next day. He offered a truce, on terms that Rome would relinquish any holdings east of the Euphrates, permitting the Roman army a safe return to Syria. As part of the proposal, Surena either approached the stranded Romans on the hills in person or dispatched an embassy to convey his readiness to discuss an orderly evacuation. Crassus's troops threatened to rebel if the Parthians did not comply with his request, despite his reluctance to meet with them. When a Parthian tugged at Crassus's reins during the meeting, a violent outburst broke out, leading to the deaths of both Crassus and his generals. You see, after Crassus died, the Parthians are reported to have poured molten gold down his throat as a symbolic gesture, mocking that famous greed of his. The severed head of Crassus was later used as a prop for a scene in Euripides' Bacchae, which was presented at a banquet in front of the chief, according to Plutarch. While the remaining Romans attempted to escape at Carrhae, most of them were either killed or captured. Both equally gruesome fates. Perhaps being killed was the better option. Well, depending on how much gold the Parthians had left. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, the battle claimed the lives of about 20,000 Romans and 10,000 were taken prisoner. As a result, we chalk it up as one of the most devastating losses in Roman history. Added to that, there were not many Parthian casualties. Really, it's barely worth a mention. This defeat, which was made even more humiliating by the fact that the Parthians had taken several legionary eagles, was a crushing blow to Rome. The Roman prisoner of war who most closely resembled Crassus was found by the Parthians, who has distinguished him as a woman and paraded him through Parthia for public viewing. You wouldn't want to be that guy. This is also something that Plutarch mentions, by the way, as really where we get it from. A few other accounts mention it too. Of course, this was a clear mockery of a Roman triumph. The Parthians commanded the other Roman prisoners, too, to celebrate this fake Crassus as imperator during the parade. The Roman military culture was, parades like this, triumphs, were extremely important. The Parthians felt so confident in this victory, and you can't really blame them for rubbing it in a little bit. As for Orodes II, he defeated the Armenians and seized power of their country with the help of the remaining members of the Parthian army. Of course, the Armenians, being the allies of the Romans, didn't really have anybody to help them anymore. But on the other hand, the Parthian king became even more enraged by Surena's victory and ordered them to be put to death. Orodes II sent his son Pacorus on a military expedition in Roman Syria after Surena died, but the expedition was ultimately unsuccessful. And so, the Battle of Carrhae is one of the most important battles fought at the start of this whole play of the Roman-Parthian conflict. The victory served as his catalyst for Parthia's several invasions of Armenia and Syria, each of which had differing degrees of success, but furthermore to this, Rome had realized that its legionaries could not successfully engage Parthian cavalry in open combat, at least not without assistance. Things had to change. And they did. One must learn from their mistakes, of course. In fact, one of Crassus's quaestors, Gaius Cassius Longinus, was in charge of leading the roughly 10,000 soldiers who had actually made it out of Syria alive to their destination. He remained the proquaestor of the province for 2 more years, successfully repelling further attacks at the hands of Pacorus, the son of Orodes. Cassius successfully repelled the Parthian attack on Antioch, his capital. Osaces, the second in command of the Parthian leadership, was killed when Cassius ambushed Pacorus's army in Antigonea as they were fleeing back to their home base. Cicero even congratulated him. He spoke pretty highly of the victory, too. Cassius later made a substantial contribution to the scheme to assassinate Julius Caesar in 44 BC. But then, of course, we have that great little theory that comes out of China that I absolutely adore, the theory that the inhabitants of the town of Liqian, I think it's either Liqian or Liqian, I'm not sure. There is this theory that they were descended from the prisoners taken at Carrhae, which was put forth in 1940s by Homer Dubbs, an American professor at Chinese history at the University of Oxford. Generally, this is the hypothesis. During the Battle of Carrhae, which took place between the Chinese and the Xiongnu in 36 BC, the prisoners might have been mercenaries. Dubbs hypothesized that the Parthians re-established the prisoners on their eastern border. Even Chinese chroniclers describe the use of a double wooden palisade structure and a fish-scale formation of soldiers, which is thought to be a reference to the testudo formation and a Roman-only defensive tactic. Both of these buildings were made completely of wood, by the way, so unfortunately they do not really survive too well. As of yet, no artifacts, such as coins or weapons that could potentially attest to Roman presence, have been discovered in the area, and the great majority of historians don't really agree with the theory, but it's a good little bit of fun, though, I think. Well, getting away from theories and imagination, we get back to the Romans seeing the Parthian siege of legionnaires' battle standards, these golden eagles, as a real moral setback, but also this sign of impending disaster. Caesar was preparing to wage a war of retaliation at the time of his murder, you see. In the event that Caesar prevailed, it was assumed that he would have faced harsh punishment because the surviving son of Crassus would have been part of the Roman army. However, a major event that resulted in the establishment of the imperial monarchy throughout Rome was indeed the fall of the Roman Republic. The republican system of governance began to fall apart in 88 BC, arguably a little bit earlier, but this was the time when Sulla launched his first invasion into Rome, which really was the catalyst. But the loss of his legions and Crassus's death fundamentally altered the balance of power in Rome. A previous theory proposed that the dissolution of the first triumvirate, which might have been caused by the death of Crassus, as well as the death of Julia in the year 54, who was both Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife. In any case, civil war eventually broke out as a result. Caesar's triumph swiftly turned the Republic into an all-out dictatorship. Now I know what you're thinking. What about the account from Plutarch? When's he going to read it? Well, I'm going to read it now, don't worry. So here we have a little bit of an account from Plutarch. It's about the point of the meeting between the Parthians and the Romans to discuss terms. The first of the barbarians to meet him were two half-bred Greeks, who leaped from their horses and made obeisance to him. Then, addressing him in the Greek tongue, they urged him to send a party forward to assure themselves that Surena and those about him were advancing to the conference without armor and without weapons. Crassus replied that if he had the least concern for his life, he would not come into their hands, but nevertheless he sent two Rusci brothers to inquire on what terms and what numbers they should hold in their meeting. These men were promptly seized and detained by Surena, while he himself with his chief officers advanced on horseback, saying, "What is this? The Roman imperator on foot, while we are mounted?" Then he ordered a horse to be brought to Crassus, and when Crassus answered that neither of them was at fault, since each was following the custom of his country in this meeting, Surena said that from that moment there was a truce, and between King Herodes and the Romans, but it was necessary to go forward to the river Euphrates, and there have the contracts put into writings. "For you Romans, at least," he said, "are not very mindful of agreements," and he held out his right hand to Crassus. Then what Crassus proposed, to send for a horse, Surena said that there was no need for it. "For the king offers you this one," he said. At the time, a horse with a gold-studded bridle stood at Crassus's side, and the grooms lifted up Crassus and mounted him, and then ran along by him, quickening his horse's pace with blows. Octavius was the first to seize the bridle, and after him Petronius, one of the legendary tribunes. Then the rest of the Romans in the party surrounded the horse, trying to stop him, and dragging away those who crowded in upon Crassus at either side. Scuffling forward in a tumult, then blows, Octavius drew his sword and slew the groom of one of the barbarians, but another smote Octavius down from behind. Petronius had no offensive weapons, but when he was struck on the breastplate, leaped down from his horse unwounded. Crassus was killed by a Parthian named Pomaxathres. Surena now took the head and hand of Crassus and sent them to Herodes in Armenia. But he himself sent word by messengers to Seleucia that he was bringing Crassus there alive, and prepared a laughable sort of procession in which he insultingly called a triumph. That one of his royal captives who bore the great likeness to Crassus, Caius Bachianus, put on a woman's royal robe, and under instructions to answer to the name Crassus and the title of imperator when so addressed, was conducted along on horseback. Before him rode trumpeters and a few lictors borne on camels. From the faces of the lictors purses were suspended, and their axes were fastened, Roman heads newly cut off. Behind these followed the courtesans of Seleucia, musicians, who sang many scurrilous and ridiculous songs about the effeminacy and cowardice of Crassus, and these things were for all to see. But before the assembled senate of Seleucia, Surena bought the licentious books of the Milesica of Aristides, and in that matter at least there was no falsehood on his part, for the books were found in the baggage of Roscius, and gave Surena on occasion to heap much insulting ridicule on the Romans, since they could not, even when going to war, let subjects and writings alone. The people of Seleucia, however, appreciated the wisdom of Aesop when they saw Surena with a wallet full of obscenities from the Milesica in front of him, but trailing behind him a Parthian Sybaris in so many wagon loads of concubines. After a fashion, this train was counterpart to the fabled Echine and Sictale among serpents, by showing its conspicuous and forward portions fearful and savage with spears, archery, and horse, but trailing off in the rear of the line into dances, cymbals, lutes, and nocturnal revels with women. Roscius was certainly culpable, but it was shameless in the Parthians to find fault with Milesica, when many of the royal line of their Arsacidae were sprung from Milesian and Ionian courtesans themselves. End of the account from Plutarch. So, just finishing up, several historians have noted how much time had elapsed between Crassus's passing and the start of the Civil War. You see, it's been noted that the death almost broke the first triumvirate's ties to this blue-blooded aristocracy. The state as a whole was thus exposed to the conflict that ultimately resulted in the start of the Civil War. Thus the removal of some private checks and balances, like the bond between Crassus and Metellus by Scipio, that had been containing political tensions, may have been one of the battle's immediate effects. But on the other hand, the battle did not significantly harm Rome in the long run in a regional sense, mainly because Publius Ventidius Bassus prevented and drove back Parthia's subsequent retaliatory invasion of Rome in 40 BC. And along with that, even though this campaign also failed, the battle didn't stop Mark Antony from invading Parthia himself in 36 BC, which of course nothing could. Well, with that we get to the end of the Battle of Carrhae. Hope you enjoyed it. A little bit of an embarrassment for the Romans, but you can't win all the time now, can't you? Well, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters, that is both on YouTube and Patreon. We have always the member-exclusive videos, which are a little bit more light-hearted. They're a good bit of fun. Here's the list. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, and a big thank you to Josie for being a top-level subscriber. Thank you, Josie. And thank you for listening so far. Now, I'll be back tomorrow, perhaps back in ancient times or something a little bit more modern, but that I will be here, as I always am for you. But until then, as always, I wish you the customary good night, and lots of love to you all. See you next time.